Emerald, Chris,
All right, awesome. Thank you so much for having me. Like Nitya said, I'm Emerald, and I was able to do some research with the Sooke data. I did my honors thesis with the Surreal Lab with the supervision of Dr. Chris Bone, and I finished that earlier this year. So the presentation I'm going to give today is going to kind of go over the research and the results from that. I'm not sure if you do want to introduce yourself right now, Chris, before I share my screen.
Sure. Hey everyone, my name is Chris Bone. I'm an associate professor in geography at the University of Victoria, and just want to say thank you to Nitya for organizing and for inviting us for this talk. And of course, thanks to Emerald for all her hard work on this project.
do you want me to? You can share the screen, Emerald. So
yeah, I will. Okay, is that able to be seen?
Yes, it looks, yes, I can, we can see
do one thing here. Oh, so let me drag it around. There we go. And there we go. Okay, so you can see the presentation now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, like I said, this was my honors thesis research that I finished up earlier this year, and I was focusing on how human activities in the Sooke Wilderness area and the Greater Victoria Water Supply area are impacting cougars. So I'll first kind of go through a couple concepts that were kind of central to the research and will hopefully kind of help inform the results as well. So the first thing I wanted to discuss was kind of this idea of how human disturbance can create risky spaces for wildlife. So it's pretty well known that wildlife often avoid areas that have been really drastically altered by humans with really degraded habitat, such as urban areas. Lots of wildlife species will avoid those areas. But those wildlife responses are really dependent on kind of that magnitude of the perceived risk by the species and that predictability of risk, both within time and space by the species. And so absent of this kind of large scale habitat destruction, wildlife can also be impacted by kind of lower disturbance activities. So a good example of this is, for example, along a hiking trail. We'll see kind of a consistent stream of hikers. This disturbance might not be every hour of every day, but it is consistent enough across space and time where that hiking trail with that high human use might become more of a riskier space for wildlife compared to a trail with a lower amount of disturbance. And so this can be applied to a similar concept of risky times. And so this also requires the disturbance to be kind of consistent within time. And so wildlife might still be able to use these spaces, but they'll just use those spaces at slightly different times. And something else to consider when we are looking at wildlife responses to human disturbance or any type of disturbance is that they're really context specific, and there's lots of other trade-offs that occur within the landscape with risks and rewards that might kind of impact their responses to disturbance. So that disturbance on the landscape might not be the only thing that is going to play into their responses to risky places and risky times. So a good example of this is wildlife species moving into kind of more urban areas. These areas will generally represent more of a risky space for wildlife, but there is lots of observations and lots of research that does show that wildlife species such as cougars will sometimes use those kind of semi-urban areas, and they will hunt in those areas. So an individual moving into a risky space could be impacted by lots of other things, and one of those other impacts could be resources. So these responses are really complex, and this kind of just gives an overall view of kind of what I had in mind when I was looking at kind of doing research on how recreation is impacting wildlife. So lots of research shows that carnivores are impacted by these kind of lower disturbance activities, such as recreation. So even though we have this large intact habitat, there still can be some responses from wildlife, such as decrease in habitat use and changes to the times of day that animals might use those sites, where that recreational activity is higher. And why is this important to look at? Well, carnivores play really important ecological roles within communities, and if their role is being impacted, this might have impacts across the ecosystem. For example, with large predators, they have strong impacts on prey species, and prey species have large impacts on vegetation communities. So these kind of impacts can cascade throughout ecosystems. And so for my research, I kind of wanted to look at both the risky times and risky places aspects of how recreation might be impacting wildlife. So the first research question was really about that risky places concept. So does the frequency of anthropogenic site use influence the frequency of site use by cougars? So at sites where we are seeing higher human activity, do we see that that is impacting how cougars also use those sites? And the second question was related to the risky times concept. So do recreational activities impact the activity patterns of cougars? So at sites with more recreation, are we seeing that cougars use those sites differently than sites without? And so if you're not familiar with the study site, it's the Sooke Hills Wilderness Area Regional Park, so shown in beige there on the map. And then there is the Greater Victoria Water Supply Area shown in green. And as Nitya mentioned before, there's 50 cameras deployed within this area. For this analysis, 47 of those cameras had data that was ready to be used. And the kind of total area that cameras are within is about 40 kilometers squared. And from these cameras, I used a date range of May 1st to September 30th of complete data. And so these two areas are pretty distinct. The Sooke Hills Wilderness area, there's lots of recreation there. It's a really popular area for hiking and mountain biking and dog walking, and there's quite a lot of trails that see pretty high human use. Conversely, the Greater Victoria Water Supply Area, public access is very restricted, and the human presence in this area is mostly just vehicle traffic, so CRD trucks and other traffic such as like logging trucks. So kind of two very different areas in terms of the type of human disturbance. And the area shown in that hash gray color is the Greater Victoria Water Protection Zone. So this just serves as a buffer between the park and the water supply area. And within that area, recreation is also not permitted. And so I'll just briefly kind of go over how I did my research. I won't get into kind of the models and stuff. I just want to kind of go over kind of what I was able to look at. So for my first method, I compared a couple different hypotheses. So kind of I was looking at what is the best predictor of cougar site use. So going back to that first question, are we seeing that anthropogenic site use is the largest driver of cougar site use? So I was able to compare kind of 4 different models. The first one included human disturbance, so that included hiking as well as vehicle traffic. The second one included prey, such as Roosevelt elk and deer. So going back to what I was discussing before with risk versus resources, I thought it was important to take into account that there was other drivers at those sites that might be influencing how cougars use those sites. I also included habitat as well, so elevation, distance to water features, forest cover, as well as forest stand age. And these are all variables that have been found in previous research, also impact how cougars might use a given landscape. And then the final model was just something to compare those two, where cougar habitat use is random. So this allowed to look at the frequency of cougar site use at each of the sites in relation to those 4 different hypotheses. The second method allowed us to look at when cougars were using those sites, so what times of day they were most active, and this just takes into account the timestamp that's on all of the camera trap images, and it also split up the Greater Victoria water supply area and the Sooke Hills wilderness area, and compared how cougars might use those areas differently, given that there's different types of disturbance. So I'll get into some results now. I'm going to show some graphs, but I'll explain what the axes mean, and hopefully this will be able to kind of demonstrate what the results are showing. So of those kind of 4 different hypotheses that I tested, I found that the one that came out on top was the human disturbance model. So that meant the best predictor of cougar site use out of those 4 models was human disturbance. And so within that model, there was both human detections as well as vehicle detections. So I'll show a graph now of cougar response to human detections. You can see on the y-axis is going to be cougar detections, and x-axis is human detections. And we can see that there is a fairly distinct negative correlation to this. So we can see as human detections increase, cougar detections fall quite rapidly. And so this is all of the sites combined. So we're using sites from the water supply area with very little human activity, as well as sites from the park here too. And also included in this model was vehicle traffic. So the result that we found for vehicle traffic was interesting and not exactly what we predicted before we did this analysis. And so this is the same type of graph, with cougar detections on the y-axis and vehicle detections on the x-axis. And we can see that there's actually a slightly positive interaction between cougars and vehicle detections. And I'll kind of explain what these results might imply. I'll just go through the temporal results first. And so those were the two results from the kind of cougar site use, the more spatial aspect. And now we'll go through the results from our activity pattern analysis. So looking at the times of day that cougars are most active between those 2 areas. So for these graphs, it's going to be on the y-axis, we're going to have cougar detections again. But on the x-axis, it's going to just be time, so 0 to 24 hours. And so for the Sooke Hills wilderness area, the result is pretty much what we would expect for humans, shown on that blue line there. So there's a peak around midday and not much activity at night. Whereas cougars are kind of showing pretty distinct peaks in the early morning and later in the evening. And the shaded gray area is showing kind of that coefficient of overlap. So how much on a scale of 0 to 1 do those 2 curves overlap between humans and cougars within the park? And so this second graph is showing the results for the Greater Victoria water supply area. So we can see a pretty similar activity pattern shown in blue with vehicles. So instead of cougars and humans, this is cougars and vehicles, as this was the most common type of disturbance within the Greater Victoria water supply area. So we see a similar response for cougars with some pretty distinct peaks in the morning and later evening, but we do see a little bit more overlap between vehicle traffic and cougars in terms of the times of day that they are most active. And so at the bottom of the graphs here, that's just the coefficient of overlap. as I mentioned before, that's just the amount of kind of gray space that is shaded in there. And so as we can see from the graph, the coefficient of overlap is a bit higher for the water supply area. And so when we compare these two cougar distributions to see if they did differ significantly between the park and the water supply area, we did not find that there was a significant difference within these results. So the overall distribution of cougar time detections in the park and the water supply area is still very similar. And so what might be some of the reasons cougars are responding this way? So going back to the result that human disturbance was that kind of greatest predictor for cougar site use. And we found that recreation is causing a negative impact, whereas vehicles, there was a slight positive association. Kind of the first explanation for this is that recreation may be creating those risky spaces for cougars within the park. So they may be avoiding those hiking trails in order to avoid humans. This is a bit different for vehicles. Because we're seeing those two opposing results, it might be that cougars do not have the same kind of risky space response to vehicle traffic along roads within the Greater Victoria water supply area. And some of the reasons for that is that cougars might be selecting for those kind of wider, kind of well-maintained roads that do get more vehicle traffic. So as opposed to some of the roads within the Greater Victoria water supply area that have been decommissioned and they're overgrown, this might just make movement more difficult. So for example, in the image on the screen here, that's a cougar walking along a decommissioned road. So those roads are overgrown, there's logs falling down. So traveling along those kind of well-maintained roads might be easier than traveling through dense vegetation. And other research has found that cougars do kind of seek out roads for efficient movement. Another reason for the attraction to roads could be because species such as deer are often also attracted to those features for vegetation. So roads often have lots of great forage all along the sides, so cougars might be following deer or elk there too. And kind of thirdly, to kind of tie both the recreation and the vehicles together, cougar selection of roads might just be caused by the infrequency of disturbance on those roads. There's far kind of less disturbance on those roads compared to the trails, even though there are some vehicles. It's not kind of that same magnitude of disturbance. And so kind of going back to the risks and rewards, the risks of kind of that perceived risk from recreation might be outweighing the rewards of, for example, prey and habitat at those sites. And so for the temporal results, even though we did see a slightly more overlap between vehicles and cougars compared to cougars and hikers, we did not find that this was a significant difference. So cougars did not show a strong temporal result, meaning they did not significantly alter the times of day that they used those sites. This increased overlap with vehicles does require some further investigation. It is an interesting kind of result that we found, but definitely needs to be investigated with more detail, perhaps different methods and more variables to kind of tease out this potential relationship. And one of the potential reasons for why we didn't find a strong temporal response is just that cougars are naturally a nocturnal species, and they're naturally very active at dawn and dusk when there is less recreation. So there might just not be that need for that large change in their activity patterns. And so just a couple things in terms of things about the study and future research. This analysis did only incorporate those 5 months of data. And so with future analyses, there'll be kind of longer timeframes and more detections to work with. This is sampling along kind of trails and roads, so that just needs to be taken into account when we are kind of interpreting these results. As well as cougars are a fairly low density species. They are high density on the island compared to elsewhere in Canada, but compared to a species like deer, they are kind of lower density, so there is just challenges that come with that too. So these preliminary results do demonstrate avoidance of recreation, but future research will be able to incorporate more things and be able to kind of investigate these relationships with more detail and provide a bit more context to these findings too. And these kind of changes to cougar spatial habitat use that we found do have impacts on others and on other species. So future research will take into account how cougars may be interacting more so with other species, which will also be able to kind of fill out that picture and be able to kind of inform how the mammal community is responding as a whole. And so that was everything I had prepared in terms of discussing my research and what we found. And I have some more camera pictures to show because that's always the best part. There's lots of really awesome ones of kind of young cougars like here. And there's a family that has been seen quite a lot on lots of the camp cameras. So those are always really cool to see. This one of them playing is pretty cool. And yeah, that was everything I had prepared. If anyone has any questions, then yeah, thank you again for having me to be able to discuss my research.
Thanks, Emerald. That's wonderful. Maybe we'll stop sharing your screen now.
For sure, yeah.
Open it up for questions. But I think, Chris, maybe we'll stop recording at this point, and then people can come in and with their questions, and but we won't record that piece of it. So please